delighted today to be joined by Alexandra Belmonte, Head of Foreign Trade Controls at Maersk. For those of you who don't know Maersk, it is the world's largest shipping container lines. Alexandra, welcome. Thank you for joining us to talk about your experiences. So let's begin by asking about Maersk's readiness for dealing with the current crisis and the challenges posed. Can you just explain how are things for you, essentially?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me, and I'm very happy to join this set of webinars. Well, we had a cyber attack in 2017 in the summer, so that has given a lot of good learnings that we can now use in the COVID-19 crisis. Essentially, what happened was we went black overnight, so we had no access to our IT or operational infrastructure. So it felt like we went back 50 years in time, having to do everything manually. So load list was manual operations, someone like basically writing on the list, using the phone a lot, and Gmail accounts. And we all know that in the COVID crisis, cybersecurity threat is real. So we have used lots of those learnings in this situation as well. And using Gmail accounts is not a good solution. So when this happened, we were very quick. Within 1 week, all of us had access to our VPNs, which is much more stable infrastructure, and of course reduces the risk for cyber attacks. So I think for us, using all the learnings from the cyber attack has made us agile, so we could quickly adapt to working from home. Because I think 70% of us within Maersk, we now work from home, and we're basically running the business. I wouldn't say as nothing has happened, because of course everyone is impacted by this crisis, but we're still operating and providing services to our customers.
Great, thank you.
And then.
And I understand Maersk has, one of the things I really wanted to ask you is that I understand Maersk has put in place a COVID-19 donation policy. Could you just explain a little bit about how that policy works and its purpose, please?
Yeah, so we do receive regular requests for donations, but with the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen like an increase in those requests, and many of them are like time sensitive. So we receive requests from local communities as well as UN and other NGOs. So we put in place this policy in order to be able to attend to them, but also kind of make quick decisions. So the policy is applicable to all of Maersk, and there's a donations committee that will review the request on a weekly basis and prioritize who should we contribute to and who should we reject. And we split it in two categories. So the first category would be us donating Maersk services. So we would provide free transport of goods. We could provide reefer storage, that's typical for pharmaceuticals, for example. The second category would be internal supply or use of special procured COVID-19 related equipment. So, for example, personal protective equipment, respiratory equipment, etc. So in the second scenario, it would either be for like our own supply chain, or we would procure it for, say, the UN. So we treat those two differently. And then the EU issued an export control regulation to restrict the flow of personal protective equipment out of the EU because of the shortage. So that has been incorporated in the donations policy, so that we don't accept a donation and then it turns out we can't perform because we don't have the necessary export control licenses in place. So we incorporated that into policy, and that's also to manage the business expectations, so they kind of know they can't just go ahead and approve things without checking with us first.
Okay, great, thank you. And you mentioned, well, you alluded to the new EU requirements and the implementation of the new trade requirements to protected equipment. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means for Maersk and how you're responding to that?
Of course. So the purpose, as I alluded to, was it controls the movement of this personal protective equipment, and that is because there's shortages in the EU. Well, it's shortages globally, as we've seen on the news. The new regulation provides, it has a list of personal protective equipment such as gloves, masks, protective clothing, face shields, so things you would be using in hospitals, but also that we could use if we want a face mask, for example. So they control the movement of that. So if you're going to export that out of the EU, you need permission from your relevant or competent authority. For Maersk, being headquartered in Copenhagen, being a Danish company, we need to apply for a license from the Danish Business Authority. And that is regardless where this item comes from. So if we were buying, say, a mask in France and we're going to ship them to our office in South Africa, we still would need to go to our Danish Business Authority to apply for a license. What to note here is the difference is if we are procuring the items, so if Maersk is buying them, or we are the exporter of record, that's when we need a license from the Danish Business Authority under this new regulation. But if we are merely providing the transport services, so we're shipping the goods, say, from France to South Africa, but it's the UN who has procured the items, well, then a license is not necessary. So there's a distinction there. And currently, we haven't had any export out of outside the EU.
Okay, so watch this space. Finally, can I ask you just to spend 2 minutes, please, on the sanctions? And is it compliance as normal? What challenges are you seeing in the sanctions compliance space?
Well, I think largely it's compliance as normal. We are, of course, seeing an increased focus, but that started before the COVID crisis from regulators that shipping, logistic, insurance were now in focus of the regulators. So we have already started to game up our sanctions compliance program to meet those expectations. But what we have seen in the COVID crisis, I think that has accelerated some of the trading patterns that we have seen previously. So, for example, if you look at Italy, when they had needed help the most, they turned to EU for help. But the EU rejected that request, and instead the help came from Russia and Cuba. And of course, that put new sanctions challenges for us because Russia is sanctioned to some extent, and Cuba is a highly sanctioned country in many respects, although not by the EU. So that, of course, changes the landscape for us and how we do business and what mitigating measures we need to implement to make sure we capture all transactions and parties involved in those transactions. And we also seen that pattern when it comes to other sanctioned and highly sanctioned countries. So Latin America, Venezuela, that the vendors and the supply chain demands are changing, and also the customer profiles. So a third-party management process is essential to kind of know your suppliers and know your customers as well. Because I think with the COVID crisis, of course, many will run out of business, but you see the geopolitical shift as well. So that would definitely impose new challenges, which we, of course, need to monitor and make sure that we cover in our sanctions compliance program.
Great. And I think, these new challenges are something we will certainly be looking at in more detail during this series. Alexandra, can I say thank you so much for joining us today? That was really insightful, and we look forward to continuing the engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.